Hello and welcome to the first session of the seminar, The Reality of Structure, Structural Realism and Structuralism in Contemporary Philosophy by Daniel Sacilotto. This seminar proposes to explore different iterations of the structuralist and structural realist thesis in contemporary philosophy, integrating this understanding into a comprehensive view concerning the role of the concept of structure within philosophical history. Broadly understood, structural realism is the thesis according to which the formalized kernel of scientific theories or mathematical languages can assume a positive ontological or epistemological role. In its most radical forms, it posits not only that mathematics plays an ontological role, but that the forms described by mathematical or formalized vocabularies designate in the last instance all there really is. For example, that the world of observable objects and their properties, of middle-sized objects and qualities, compose a fabric of appearances in relation to the real unobservables posited by scientific mathematical languages. While the term structural realism is first introduced by John Worrall in 1989 in the context of providing an account of scientific progress across theory changes, in the broad sense defined above, the core tenets of structural realism can be traced to the origins of Western philosophical history. The view according to which it is mathematics or mathematized languages that allow us to pierce beyond the realm of appearances and access the real. Accordingly, structural realism is oftentimes associated with a kind of Platonism or Pythagoreanism that posits that mathematics is the key to escape the delusions of common sense, natural language, or the veil of sensible presentation. With this said, the concept of structure is hardly univocal between philosophical registers, such that different versions of structural realism emerge in relation to how authors privilege specific formal vocabularies as scientific theories as plausible solutions to specific problems. Following from Worrall's definition and project, ontic structural realism emerges as a lever toward a naturalist epistemology of science and a scientific realist ontology, one that above all escapes the anti-realist consequences associated with Thomas Kuhn's thesis of incommensurability when accounting for the logic of scientific revolutions. In contrast, within the 20th century French post-war tradition that continues to this day, extending structuralist approaches to the social sciences and psychoanalysis became the key toward a reconstituted materialist philosophy that escaped the idealism or quietism following post-Heideggerian historicist, existentialist, and phenomenological approaches. In this process, the lines dividing naturalism and Platonism, pure mathematics and empirical science become progressively blurred, as different formal paradigms become reified or privileged as providing the relevant conception of structure: geometry, formal logic, set theory, category theory, type theory, information theory, structural semiotics, the differential calculus, etc. In the first introductory session, we will engage in a protracted history of structuralism and structural realism within philosophy, from antiquity and until the present, from its implicit Platonic inception to its contemporary iterations. During the second week, we explore the 20th century extension of structuralist approaches to psychoanalysis and the social sciences in the post-war French context, attempt to forge new materialist epistemologies and ontologies, focusing on key texts by Jacques-Alain Miller, François Regnon, and Gilles Deleuze. In the third week, we explore the contemporary application of ontic structural realism as defined by John Worrall for a scientific realist epistemology and metaphysics, looking at works by James Lademan and Stephen French. In the fourth and final week, we explore the attempt to extend the structural realist thesis into a structural systematics in the work of Lawrence Pontel, in which the ambitions of German idealism become rekindled and the concept of structure becomes rigorously clarified. Okay. Daniel Sacilotto is a PhD in comparative literature from the University of California, Los Angeles. His research focuses on the fields of contemporary philosophy and Latin American literature. In particular, his research focuses on the reconciliation of rationalism and materialism, and the methodological relation between epistemology and ontology in contemporary philosophy. He is currently finishing a full-length monograph tentatively titled Saving the Noumenon, an essay on the foundations of ontology, in which he proposes a critical reading of the ontological term in contemporary philosophy and lays the foundations for a new transcendental epistemology, chiefly inspired in the works of Wilfrid Sellars, Robert Brandom, Alain Badiou, Lawrence Puntel, Ray Brazier, Reza Negarestani, and Jay Rosenberg. Daniel, please take it away.
Hey, thank you, Arnab. Pleasure. Welcome, everybody. I'm Daniel, obviously. It's good to see many familiar faces and many new ones as well. Before we get to today's business and, of course, today introductory session, we're going to go through logistics and stuff like that. I will spare us the logistics for the end so that we don't get bored too quickly. But as usual, I would like to begin by just doing a round of introductions. Everybody just, briefly stating your name, what your philosophical background, your training in philosophy is, if at all. It's always helpful to know for me, just to know how much pedagogical sort of background knowledge I need to impart while contextualizing information. And yeah, what's your interest in the class? Anything you want to disclose about yourselves. So I'm just gonna go through. That's okay, Arnab. I'm gonna go by order, just in the order of how I see people here. Maria is first. Yep.
Hi, I'm an editor of a magazine about visual aesthetics, but I'm a linguist, and my interest here is philosophy of language. I'm not really interested in legitimative discourses in art, more in what language is capable of. That's why I'm here. And I also love very much all Daniel's seminars. That's the honest reason.
Well, thank you for that. We have Emma afterwards. Emma Stewart, sorry.
Hey guys, so I'm an architecture undergrad student with very introductory philosophical experience. So trying to be like a quick learner, but it's certainly an exciting mountain.
Cool, thank you. We then have Kenneth Pietrobono. And please correct me if I mispronounce your name.
No, spot on. Hi, I'm an artist, kind of similarly with kind of a spattering of philosophical background that is not complete at all. But a lot of my work is around kind of social construction. And so, for example, I'm doing a project right now where I'm offering to pay media writers to not use a list of 30 words in their text for up to 1 year. So I've been doing that for about 5 years now. And anyway, so just like kind of really understanding these kind of loops of how reality is shaped, who has the power to make it viscous, who experiences it as solid and real. So anyway, thank you.
And don't worry, Pablo just said that if for whatever reason it's not feasible for you to do your introduction today, you can do it later or the next session. It's fine. Afterwards, we have Felipe Felizardo.
Hi, I'm Felipe Felizardo. I'm in Portugal, and I guess I could say I used to be an artist. My philosophical background is patchy, but I'm now ending my first year in the critical philosophy certificate program, and this is the last seminar I will take before starting to write my project, which strongly hinges upon Puntel's work, and is supposed to be something about developing a pedagogical program for philosophy in the early infancy. So this is right up my alley. Thank you for this.
Cool, thank you. Afterwards, we have Mariana Marangoni.
Hi, everyone. I'm an artist and a lecturer in software studies, and I have no formal background in training in philosophy, and this is my very first seminar here at the new center, so I'm excited.
Thank you. Welcome. Afterwards, we have Will Fraser.
Yes, I guess I'm primarily a musician, but over the past couple of years, I've gotten really into philosophy independently, kind of working my way back from post-structuralism to fill in all the genealogical trajectories and gaps. I've really enjoyed kind of on my own retroactively auditing a couple of your courses, Daniel. So I'm also here because I find you a really brilliant teacher. And I'm excited. I'm really interested in structuralism and feel myself on the verge of getting into some of the Ladyman and French and the Puntel. So I'm excited for this to be my introduction to a lot of that stuff.
Cool, thank you. I'm welcome. Afterwards, we have Max Valentic.
Hi, yeah, my name is Max. I'm from Ljubljana, Slovenia. I've been engaging with philosophy for some time now, especially with accelerationism or neo-rationalism, and I also audited some of your courses before, and I enjoy reading your Facebook posts and everything else.
Well, thank you for that. After we have Arman Salivarzi.
Arman Salivarzi. I'm a science fiction writer based in Tehran. Not much of a philosophy background, but a year here with a lot of the guys. I'm here not because of a specific topic of the course, but maybe because of the whole structure of the theme of the course. Actually, anyway, happy to be here.
Excellent. Afterwards, we have Vincent Ardidon.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Vincent. I'm a writer and researcher living in Manila, and it's currently 3 a.m. here in the morning. I don't have a formal training in philosophy, but I have a BA in language and literature. I'm interested in this course because I guess I wanted to understand the genesis and continuity of this concept or form that goes by the name structure, including its history within philosophical thought and maybe even its breaking point. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. Afterwards, we have Eduardo Camargo.
Hi, I am Eduardo Camargo. I am an artist and researcher based in Curitiba, Brazil. My interest in this course is because, and my background in philosophy was mostly through aesthetics, because I have a graduation in visual arts. And during my research, I studied a little bit of structuralism through aesthetics, close to Russian formalists, and some brands of formalism. So my interest lies mostly there in relation to the course.
Excellent. Afterwards, we have Regis Alves.
Hi, Daniel. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I'm Regis. I studied philosophy in Brazil, in São Paulo. Yeah, I finished my master's dissertation last year, and I already saw some of the seminars that Daniel gave here in NC, and I like it a lot, but I couldn't go until the end. It means I didn't do the essays, but this time I think I'm gonna do it. Yeah, because I was finishing my dissertation on Hegel, so I studied German idealism, mostly science of logic, and precisely the identity between thought and being in science of logic. So this seminar is perfect from the point of view of what I was studying, and also from what I want to study in my PhD.
Thank you. Thank you. And is the audio okay? Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah, it should be. Yeah, if you want. Yeah, my name is Enda. I'm originally from Ireland. I'm currently living in Berlin, Germany. Currently quarantining in Berlin, Germany. So apologies if my contributions are not so enthusiastic today. I'm in my third day of coronavirus. My interests are pretty broad. Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to go on about them. Yeah, and I'm an artist and a writer. Yeah, that's it.
Cool. Welcome. After we have Claudia Rishu.
Hi, I'm Claudia. My background is not in philosophy. I'm entirely self-taught. My undergrad was math and CS, and now I work in cryptocurrency stuff. But I've been self-teaching philosophy because I discovered like French theory and really liked it. And I went all the way back to Plato and I've been learning since. I'm in this class because I'm hoping that the angle on structuralism will help me better understand Derrida and other like theorists like Barthes and Bataille that I really, really like, and, you know, people from that era that I'm interested in. And then also, you know, I just have existential anxiety about Hegel, like killing the noumena, and I want them to come back. So I'm interested in this theory that like rescues them, I guess.
Great, welcome. After we have Pablo Aguilar. I think Pablo said, oh yeah, you can't. Are you okay? Can you speak, or is it too noisy?
I can speak, but it's not noisy enough that I can make a lot of sound. So
oh, it's fine. It's fine. I think we can hear you.
Okay. Well, I'm Pablo Aguilar. I'm based in Mexico City, but I'm spending the weekend in Oaxaca, also in Mexico, a little bit to the south. I have a background in architecture, but I've always been a philosophy student. And as many had already said, I'm very interested in this class, not because of structuralism, but because of post-structuralism. So I guess it was like something that gets, I don't know how to say it, like post implies that there was a before, and I'm just trying to know what that before is. And I mean, I know a little bit about Lévi-Strauss and about Saussure and like the doxiographic structural movement, particularly in linguistics, but I'd really like to know more. And I'm very excited because I'd never read Plato's Cave before until the reading for this seminar, so I'm excited.
Welcome.
Thank you.
After we have Swati Sina.
Hi, this is Swati, and I'm from India. I do not have a formal background in philosophy. I'm in the process of completing my dissertation, which is in literature. So the reason why I enrolled for the course was some sections of my dissertation would be looking into structuralist aspects, especially I think delusions, theory of semantics or semology. So that's a section, that's what drew me into the course. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. I think that's it for the panelists. There's a few attendants. I don't know if any of them are there. Well, I can't see them. So I'm gonna not ask the attendees. If you join as panelists next time, I'll let you introduce yourselves. And if anybody wants to just write in the chat who they are and they prefer to, Dilshad, I know your connection's unstable, but it's fine if you just write it in the chat panel, and that should be all right. Okay, just let me make sure I didn't miss anybody. Did I miss anybody? Give me a hands up if I didn't. I think I got everybody. Yes. All right, great. So we can get started then. Awesome. Welcome everybody. I'm Daniel, obviously. So today, as stated in the syllabus, I won't be getting into terrible detail into the text themselves. Today will be much more of an introductory session where I'm going to try to contextualize the seminar, the questions that we're going to be dealing with, giving you a sort of protracted elevator pitch into the history of the problem and the questions that we're going to be asking throughout the seminar. So hopefully this will give you a feel for the kinds of questions that we're going to be tackling all throughout. Those of you who have attended or seen previous seminars of mine know how I like to begin usually by sort of just formulating the central question that is going to be the guiding thread throughout the seminar. And so I will be speaking about that, and I will be obviously speaking about a series of interrelated concepts that I think are going to set the foundation for the conversation concerning really the central concept, which is that of structure, right? I am not going to give a definition of structure from the get-go, because one of the things that I think we're going to see rather quickly is that that's part of the very question or the very problem that we're going to be tackling. What I will be doing is rather beating around the bush, as it were, trying to clarify some of the subsidiary concepts, positions, and general historical context through which the question of structure, the concept of structure becomes a prescient concept for us, and which is going to guide the course, of course. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is just, as usual, I present through some PowerPoints. These will be uploaded in the readings in the drive, in the class drive after each class, so you can revise and go over them. I find that people tend to make good use of these, so these will be available. With regards to logistics, as I mentioned earlier, we will be covering that towards the end of today's session, so I'll be leaving the last maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes for that, and to answer any questions about logistics. Anything else that I want to say? Well, Hernan, maybe you want to introduce yourself. Forgive me, I did not. I forgot.
That's fine.
Yes.
I'm Arnab Lumenthal. I'm based in Argentina. Well, right now I'm in Uruguay for a week. I'm a biochemist, and my training in philosophy was not until I became a member of the New Center for Research and Practice. I finished my certificate last year. And right now I'm in a sort of transition. We'll probably go on to do a master's in philosophy in Edinburgh September of this year. So yeah, and I'm generally interested in structuralism from the get-go because I have like a scientific empirical background. So yeah, that's it.
Excellent, thank you. And one more thing before we get started is so I will be presenting through the PowerPoint. Now, everybody here, as usual, with these seminars, come from very different backgrounds. Some of you have more substantive background in philosophy, training in philosophy than others. So do forgive me if I become pedagogical at moments and, just try to clarify stuff that might seem slightly platitudinous to those of you who do have a formal background. But because some of you don't, I think it's important just to try to be as clear as possible, okay? So I will be, introducing certain concepts that are very quote unquote fundamental with regards to philosophical questioning. And that's part of what I do today. The other thing is, those of you who have been, who are familiar with my previous seminars, there's a lot of overlap in some of the questions and concerns, as is normal, and everybody has a sort of thread. I think it was, I always get, I don't know who actually said this, whether it was Heidegger or Whitehead, that every thinker thinks only one thought, right? I think it was Heidegger, but I don't know, sometimes it's attributed to Whitehead. Anyway, but the point is, so there are there's a cluster of questions, there's a central preoccupation, sounds like Heidegger, it does, that runs through my work. And those of you who have taken seminars with me before or have seen them will find some of these topics familiar. Specifically, much of what I'm going to be talking about overlaps with some of the topics that we dealt with in another seminar of mine, which is in the archive. So those of you who are interested in looking at that can do so as well, which was called The Nature of the Subject and the Subject of Nature, Naturalism and Subjectivity. And in that seminar, we explored the relationship between naturalism and Platonism rather closely in the philosophy of science, both in the analytic tradition and in the continental tradition. And much of what I will be talking about in the seminar and we will be discussing overlaps with those kinds of topics. So I'll be revisiting some familiar material, but hopefully we'll be obviously branching out into new territory as well rather quickly. But so before we get started, any provisional questions or comments anybody wants to throw in there? Anything anybody wants to say? Anything that's no? And by all means, at any point in time, anybody wants to say anything, interrupt, ask a question if anything's not clear or anything, anybody wants further background, always ripe for that. Okay, I'll be stopping periodically just to touch base and so we can decant and discuss, and we will be obviously hopefully reconvening from time to time as a group and discussing this stuff to flesh it out. So without further ado, let me just begin by presenting. So if you give me 1 second, I'm going to, it's a new computer, so I'm still.
Daniel, should I give you host rights?
I think I have them because I'm on the verge of projecting. So I guess we'll figure it out soon.
Okay, cool.
So, can everybody see the PowerPoint? Yes. Okay, and just give me a thumbs up. Phenomenal. Okay, great. So obviously, the first thing to say is that this seminar proposes to examine how the concept of structure becomes central in 20th and 21st century philosophy as a lever to reconstitute the prospects of materialism and realism in both the continental and analytic traditions. So already here we have two subsidiary concepts, that of materialism and that of realism, and I'm going to be speaking a little bit about that in short notice. And the central question, the question that will be guiding us throughout the seminar, is the one that I provisionally formulated. We will get to more quote unquote specific iterations of the central question as we proceed. But for the moment, this should do. How does the concept of structure enable philosophy to resist epistemological or ontological anti-realism or idealism in the pursuit of realism or materialism? Okay, so the idea here is not just to do a quote unquote survey of the structuralist and structural realist traditions in 20th century philosophy and until today, but specifically to understand how it is that these schools of thought and how the concept of structure become conducive to a quote unquote, again, new form of materialism or new form of realism. I believe Claudia has her hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering if you would be able to like define those four like movements. Like I think I have an idea, but like, yeah, it would just be cool to clarify.
Oh yeah. No, we'll get to that. We'll get to defining the movements and the ideas that are featured. So in short notice. So we'll get there soon. So in any case, the idea is to understand how this concept structure, which is rather central, and again, part of the problem or part of the question that we're going to be dealing with is precisely how to define this concept, how this concept is understood, and how it is that this concept really not just is a concept as it were, but it's part of a more general quote unquote strategy or methodology through which philosophy attempts to answer a series of challenges that precisely render the possibilities of realism or materialism problematic. And as a result, the obverse of this, positively, what we will see is that new forms of realism and new forms of materialism emerge as a result of the appropriation of the concept of structure. So the two traditions that we will be looking at that help us map this vector of thought in 20th century philosophy are two that, of course, if you've read we heard the description from Hernan earlier, but just to rehearse, first, we're going to be looking at the appropriation of structuralist approaches in the social sciences in the French post-war continental tradition and its extension to philosophy, beginning with the structuralist linguistics in the work of Saussure, the structuralist anthropology of Lévi-Strauss, the structuralist approach to Freudian psychoanalysis developed by Lacan, and the attempts by philosophers following this thread of appropriation of structuralist linguistics and the social sciences and psychoanalysis into philosophy in the attempt to reconstitute the valences of materialism, either in an epistemological register, that's Foucault, and a dialectical one, Althusser, Badiou, the Althusserian school, the idea of, or the prospects to reconstitute dialectical materialism and Marxism, and or in naturalism and empiricism. This is, for example, what Deleuze tries to do through the appropriation of structuralism. We're not going to be reading all of these people, obviously, but we will be speaking of these. We have, of course, precious little time. It's only 4 weeks. So what I will be doing is on top of the readings, the central readings, which we will be addressing, as a way of introduction, I will be talking about these other figures and the general historical context in which these questions become framed. Okay, so this will be progressively made clear as we move forward. And the second tradition is the development of a structural realist philosophy in the philosophy, or structural realism is a type of there, in the philosophy of science, specifically in the analytic tradition. And this begins with the epistemological venture elaborated by John Worrall in 1989. We're going to be reading Worrall's seminal paper on the topic and passing through two specific authors who in my estimation, provide the most quote unquote developed versions of the structural realist thesis in the philosophy of science, namely James Lademan and Stephen French, who developed a variation or a variant of the structural realist strategy, which goes under the name of ontic structural realism. We don't have to worry about what that means right now. That will, that's ahead of us and a little bit further down the line. But so returning to the original question, the question that begins the class, what we're going to be looking at is how these two traditions precisely formulate their appropriation of structuralism or their elaboration of structural realism as a response to a specific cluster of challenges and problems that are native to those traditions. So in the case of the appropriation of structuralism in the French post-war tradition, the first tradition, what we're going to see is that the appropriation of structuralism provides a lever to respond to specifically phenomenological and existentialist philosophies of access. This is a locution that I borrow from Graham Harman that became dominant in the French imaginary, philosophical imaginary during the first half of the 20th century, specifically through the work of Sartre, but of course through primarily the appropriation of phenomenology in the work of Husserl and Heidegger and its extension. And what this appropriation of of phenomenology and existentialism would lead to eventually, and we will see, we'll be speaking about this next week more closely, is a series of challenges and problems that ultimately seem to compromise not only the possibilities for philosophy in its theoretical ambitions, but also its practical political ambitions. So long story short, and again, I've spoken about this elsewhere, one of the problems and one of the reasons why structuralism becomes attractive in this tradition and a feasible strategy is because it was believed that existentialism and phenomenology had run out of steam, as it were, that existentialism and phenomenology had become stale when providing a philosophical theoretical basis to ground something like a revolutionary politics. And so we're going to see how precisely this appropriation of structuralism is also implicitly, and well, not only implicit, but quite explicitly, an attempt to traverse the nihilistic, relativistic, subjectivist, if you will, consequences associated with these schools of thought, with phenomenology, existentialism, historicism, and of course you could plug in there things like deconstruction, right? The second cluster of positions, the ones that belong to the second tradition that I discerned, the analytic philosophy of science and the structural realist tradition that follows thereby, is also an attempt to respond to a set of challenges, anti-realist challenges. But this time, these were waged by pragmatist and instrumentalist approaches that came to challenge the originary positivist, naturalist, and empiricist ambitions of the early project of what Robert Brandom calls the project of semantic analysis, which is what grounds the historical existence of analytic philosophy throughout the first half of the 20th century. So those of you who are, I'm guessing that if there is somebody from the analytic tradition that some of you might be familiar, that would be Wittgenstein, right? I presume some of you might be familiar with the two Wittgensteins, the Tractatus and the Investigations. The Wittgenstein of the Tractatus is still pretty much involved in a constructive project, right, in continuity with the logical empiricist ambition. The second Wittgenstein, the Wittgenstein of the Investigations, the pragmatist Wittgenstein, right, wages a challenge against this tradition, which results in a pretty deflationary approach. Well, in the second half of the 20th century, what we would see happen is an extension of these challenges to also challenge the empiricist assumptions, the realist assumptions, the naturalist assumptions that had been held in the analytic philosophy, in the philosophy of science. So the appropriation of structural realism is actually also an attempt to respond to these perceived anti-realist challenges that were waged in the second half of the 20th century. And we're going to be talking about what the challenges were, what exactly were the difficulties that were associated with these. And Worrall's paper, which will be the first thing we will read in this constellation, does a very good job given us the elevator pitch again into the cluster of questions. So it will be, I think fairly straightforward to see this. So it's actually kind of interesting because, in both cases, structure becomes the saving grace, the method, the concept, the central means through which we're going to escape these anti-realist challenges. Now, I understand what these challenges are still not clear to us, and that's fine. That's the whole point. We're going to be going through this stuff. Now, despite this common core that both of these traditions share, and despite their substantive differences, and we're going to see they're highly different, right? This common appropriation of structure leads not only to divergent conceptions of structure, but radical different ideas of what really constructive philosophy can do through the concept of structure. So we're going to be seeing that these materialist and realist alternatives that emerge are actually quite at odds with each other. And that's another thing that I find quite interesting. So in the case of the first tradition, the appropriation of structuralism through its passing in the social sciences is also coeval with an overcoming of representational epistemologies and ontologies. And there's a common defiance in this tradition against the Kantian predicament that the task of philosophy is, at the end of the day, something like examining what the conditions of access to the world are. Famously, Kant's critical project is understood as that of examining what he calls the conditions of possibility of all possible experience, the conditions of all possible experience. And this project, throughout the 20th century, in its phenomenological and historicist and deconstructionist guises, becomes extended or radicalized as the question not only of how it is, what are the conditions of epistemic access, how do we know the world, how do we represent what the world is, but how do we access the world in all these different modalities of experience that are not necessarily, or primarily at least, cognitive or epistemic in nature. In other words, as you are probably familiar, those of you who know or are a little bit familiar with the Heideggerian tradition, right? The question there is not only, is rather to this, it's not how do we know the world, how do we represent reality theoretically, but how there are these more fundamental forms of disclosure that involve, for example, engaged practice, what he calls circumspection, right? Or what sometimes is called in the literature transparent coping. Well, what we're going to see is that this appropriation of structuralism is also an attempt to defy this focus on the problematic of access, whether we conceive of access in representational terms narrowly, as Kant did, i.e. as an epistemic relationship between the subject and the world, or more broadly still, when we speak about the conditions of, say, existential access or practical access or discursive access or historical access. So there's an attempt to displace the question of access from philosophical primacy. In the name of what? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at. In the name of a kind of materialist solution. And these materialist solutions, after all, it's not just one, but it's a series of them, are actually also an attempt to reconstitute the priority of constructive ontology in relationship to epistemology, or what Heidegger called fundamental ontology, which is basically a propadeutic to ontology proper, right? The second tradition, the analytic philosophy of science and the structural realism that develops therein, on the other hand, is concerned actually with establishing and securing the scope of scientific representation. What is central for them is not the question whether we can get away of the problematic of access altogether, but rather how it is that we can make sure that we can explain how it is that science can represent the world correctly. In other words, they're trying to salvage a series of subsidiary concepts that are central to understand scientific realism. Scientific realism being, and I'm going to define these terms in the next part, but scientific realism, long story short, being the position that the entities, postulates, and principles described by the sciences are finally ontologically robust. In other words, that they describe the way the world is. Now, that might seem controversial, and it should be. But the whole point of this structural realist saga is to try to explain how it is that something like scientific progress, scientific truth, scientific correctness is possible. And why does it become necessary to explain this? It might seem rather platitudinous or obvious. Well, precisely because of the challenges that were waged by instrumentalist and pragmatist philosophers in and during the second half of the 20th century. And again, we're going to be looking at these challenges and how this tradition responds to these. Right? So in this different configuration, these different approaches, right? On the one hand, we want to get away from representation and away from access. On the other hand, we want to reconstitute the possibility of scientific representation. We want to explain how scientific representation is possible. Two very different conceptions of structure come into the fore. Not completely unrelated, but quite different. They're related in an important sense, and that's part of what I'm trying to unravel in this class. These two traditions, which are paradigmatic of the divide between analytic and continental approaches, nevertheless share a common intuition. And yet this common intuition is deployed in a completely different way by these two traditions. And it's interesting to see how these communicate with each other. I don't think it's been done before where we try to actually, trace this in parallel, as it were. So we're going to see how this plays out. So what I want to do now is just to get us started with the core concepts. I mean, I was just really rehearsing what the sort of broad brush stakes of the seminar are. But what I want to do now is first explain a couple of subsidiary concepts and terms that are going to be informing the conversations that we will be having in the weeks to come. So the first thing that I want to do is, again, as I mentioned, I'm not going to try to define the concept of structure, because what we're going to see throughout the weeks and as we read all these authors is that there's a series of definitions, narrower, broader, some catered for specific purposes. But at the end of the day, what we're going to see is we're going to try to extract what the common core that drives all of these approaches is. So in order to get us started, I think one thing that we can begin by asking ourselves is, well, when we think about structure in the quote unquote vernacular, when we think about the concept of structure in an informal common sense register, as it were, right? We would have maybe some difficulty defining it very precisely, but at the very least, we can all agree that there are certain subsidiary concepts, interrelated concepts with which it seems to hold some form of relation. And I just isolate three here, well, really four, but there's two that are interchangeable for my purposes here. The first is the concept of form. The second is the concept of order or organization. And the third is the concept of mathematical cognition, right? So these three concepts are very much interwoven in what, all the conversations we're going to be having. So just to sort of clarify, so what is form, right? And I'll stop after this slide just to decant and hopefully have a first stopgap here. Well, let's begin with form. What is form, right? Now, in the classical philosophical sense, forms are metaphysical valences. In ancient Greek philosophy, forms are actually metaphysical attributions. And they are separated, they are entities or a class of entities that are said to be separated from the realm of perceptible objects. Now, I know there's a whole debate and discussion concerning the two worlds theory. Was Plato really a dualist, blah, 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 or is there another way to read this, the two aspect theory, right? Kind of like what we do with Kant with the noumenon phenomena distinction. I'm not going to get into that because it's not worth our time right now and it's too technical. But in any case, we can agree that the distinction between form and sensation or sensible objects is central in the Platonic philosophical beginning, as it were, right? And one thing that we can say about this is that forms in the Platonic framework or theory function as not only separated entities in relation to sensible objects, but they are models, right? Models in relation to what? To objects understood as copies. So the relationship between form and object, or sensible object, also corresponds to the distinction between a model and a copy, such that the copies, the objects, are set to participate in the forms. And what this relation of participation is a matter of great controversy, discussion, and it's precisely in clarifying that we get all these different readings of Plato from antiquity until today. In Aristotle, we have a slightly different conception, although it's still woven within a metaphysical and teleological register. Now, in the case of Aristotle, as you all probably know or might know, the concept of form is actually one of the 4 kinds of causality. So it's part of an etiological, quote unquote, typology, right? Does anybody know the four causes in Aristotle? Philosophy 101 here. Ooh, let's see who's real here. let's see who knows their P's and Q's, as we say in philosophy. Okay, if nobody knows, that's fine. But so the four causes in Aristotle are matter, hyle, right? Form, that's the second one usually. The third is what is called the occasional cause, which is the way we normally understand causes in a quote unquote mechanistic register, as in A is the cause of B, in the sense that A is responsible for B, right? And finally, what he called the final cause, the telos, right? The purpose, that for which something is, right? So I'm not going to give an example because this is kind of tangential, but form is the second kind of causality, and it is closely related to the way that matter is organized. And what's interesting is that these 4 kinds of causality in Aristotle are integrated together. They're not just separate things, but the form that something has also determines its telos. So there's an interconnection, an inextricability between the form and the telos, right? So that, for example, the fact that, I don't know, the plant has a particular shape that enables it precisely to fulfill its telos, to grow and collect light and water and grow, blah, 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 right? Now, we also speak not only of form as a kind of, or said as a noun, right, as things like the forms in Plato or formal causation in Aristotle, but we also speak of formalization as a process. And this is a term actually that becomes particularly important in the structuralist post-war French tradition that we're going to be looking at, and specifically in the work of Lacan. And his students, Jacques-Alain Miller being, of course, the one that we're going to be paying attention to because Lacan is unintelligible, but as far as I'm concerned. But formalization is a central concept, right? And what is formalization? Formalization, as we're going to see in more detail when we read the action of structure, is the process of transforming an explanation or description or account of a phenomenon or domain of phenomenon, if you will, that is inscribed in a natural language or even in a scientific language, to an account that is bound by mathematical, logical axioms and rules of inference. So it is a dimension of what we call formal theorization. And we're going to, this has got to be another big deal for us, because as we're going to see, the concept of structure is going to also be very much interwoven with the question of what is a theory and how do we explain what theories do. But in any case, formalization is this process through which we grab a description of whatever phenomenon we have, a tree, a cow, the subject, right? The mind, and we try to embed it in a formal mathematical framework. And by that, I mean how it is that we can develop something analogous to, for example, what we obtain with modern science, in the sense that we have things like, laws of nature or fundamental axioms, principles of nature that regulate it. It is by achieving this kind of axiomatic rigor that we achieve formalization. And we're going to see this next week, but just jumping ahead, the reason why this concept becomes really, really important in the context that that Lacan is inhabiting is because there was always this perennial question for psychoanalysis, right? Is psychoanalysis a science? Can it become a science in any case, even if it is not? And what would it mean for it to become a science, right? It's certainly not enough, it doesn't seem, for there to be just a discourse about something for it to count as scientific, right? Well, Lacan has an answer. What distinguishes the discourse of science is precisely that it is formalized, right? It achieves formalization. Now, you can see how this conception of not only what formalization is, but what science is, leads to a peculiar understanding of science, which is precisely, if you want to call it this, physics bound or physics centric rather than biocentric. The more formal your science is, i.e. the more mathematically secure or rigorous it is, the more scientific it is, right? And this leads some people to say some crazy things, or, well, I don't know if they're crazy, but things like Badiou will say at one point early in the 60s, that biology really is not a science. He says that wild empiricism we call a science, wild empiricism, right? So, okay, so that's for form. I'm just like a provisional, right? So we have all these conceptions, a metaphysical, robust conception. We have the concept of formalization as a process, which has to do with transcribing explanations into mathematical, into a mathematized framework. Okay. We have the concept of order, and this has got to be very, very, very important. So the notion of order, right, is the notion that the entities, elements, or, you know, phenomena that populate a given domain or that we speak about in any competence whatsoever are not only autonomous, completely self-independent units, right, that we understand independently of each other precisely, but that there are some kinds of relations between them, right? And it is precisely this relationality that provides the criteria for intelligibility for these entities. The criteria of intelligibility of A is to understand how it is related to B, C, D, and whatever else might be the elements of a domain. This is going to be particularly important because it is the core of what we call today, at least in technical shop talk, relational ontology. A relational ontology is one that tries to understand the integrity of an entity or class of entities, not in terms of intrinsic properties, i.e., internal essences or qualities that these objects might have, but in terms of how they fit into a system of relations with other elements. And it is the relations that provide the intelligibility of what something is. Those of you who are familiar with Saussure, of course, are going to be rather familiar with this conception, but it is actually a conception that you can, in a certain way, almost trace to the dialectical origins of philosophy and in the modern period to the work of Hegel as well. We're going to have some to say about this as well. And finally, there's this concept, this third, not really a concept, much more of a notion in the broad sense of mathematical cognition. Now, this is especially finicky and complicated. And I can see there's 20 messages in the chat, so I'll stop after this to figure out what's going on. But with mathematical cognition, we begin by asking the question, we might begin by asking the question, well, what is mathematics, right? That seems rather lofty, and it might be rather difficult. Does anybody want to have a crack at this? I would just like to see how anybody does at defining mathematics. Does anybody have the adventurous spirit to try to define mathematics?
Is it Zermelo-Fraenkel's set theory, or is it, I don't know. It's like what Badiou does, right? He just says it's like set theory, or well, he doesn't say mathematics is set theory, but he says like the ontology, like the way that
he says mathematics is ontology, right?
Yeah.
So that's an identity claim. He says that mathematics is the discourse of being qua being. So I mean, that is fine. You can say that, right? You could say something.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. Maria.
Well, it might be a language where semantics is absent.
Ah, interesting. So you think the mathematics is it's just pure syntax?
Yeah.
Something like that. A pure
Like that.
syntax. Okay, interesting. Claudia?
Were you calling me? Oh, yeah, I thought you said Talia. I'm like, who? Anyway, I kind of like the Frege Wittgenstein conception of mathematics, where it's like you're pushing around symbols, and then also there happens to be some kind of real correlation, maybe, but not always. Like when you get to when you look at Gödel's proofs that kind of end mathematics, they basically show that the idea of mathematical knowledge being complete and true and fully in line with the world kind of rules that out. I
The
think
incompleteness
that
theorem.
what?
The incompleteness theorem, Gödel's
Yes, I think that kind of rules out anything where you'd have a definition where it's oh, this is how the universe works, because the universe doesn't have I don't think the universe has unknowable things the way that math has these paradoxical, unprovable statements. That just seems to be a trick of our own language.
So that's interesting because that provides a kind of counterpoint to the Badiou. Badiou goes very far with this. He thinks that mathematics is not just a play of symbols, or as Maria says, something that doesn't have a semantics inbuilt into it. On the contrary, mathematics is the discourse of being qua being, which is rather anathema to the way we usually explain mathematics in the abstract, which is that it is an artificial language, right? It is a set of symbols with a set of rules, namely axioms and rules of inference, right? In relation to which the manipulation of the symbols of the syntax yields every possible well-formed expression in the language, right? Through calculation, derivation, or whatever else, right? But the question becomes rather prescient the more that we advance in the history of modern science, because one thing that, of course, we understand is that this little process that Monsieur Lacan is calling formalization, right, is part of the historicity of modern science. Science becomes more and more mathematically couched, right? Mathesis universalis, and we're going to be talking about this when we get to Descartes, if we do. But the point is that mathematics cannot just simply be taken to be artificial language, a play in symbols. Never mind completeness or totalization, but there's something about mathematics and our understanding of nature, of being, of the world, that seems intimate, right? And the question is, well, how does it do this? How does mathematics, how do these apparently inert, dead symbols that by themselves carry no semantic valences, right? Numbers, sets, whatever, these abstract types, nevertheless provide the key or the clue, if you will, to decipher nature, what's going on in the world, if it does at all. Of course, that's the wager of the structuralist and the mathematical Platonist thesis. So we're going to be exploring this precise question again, which is how is it that mathematics or mathematical languages, right, assume a positive epistemological or ontological role, a descriptive role, an explanatory role, such that when we're looking at mathematical theories, we're not just looking at abstract symbols in the void, spinning in the void, as Donald Davidson, was characterized as doing by John McDowell, but actually getting a grip on the way the world is somehow. Now, that seems a rather abstract thing to understand, but that's precisely what these people are going to try to answer for us. Enda has the hand up.
Yeah, maybe this is just being like an annoying question in a sense, but I'm just sort of curious how we can ask this question whilst at the same time, presumably this is something advanced by the kind of structural realists. How can we do this whilst also saying that we're bypassing the kind of the question about access, the Kantian question of access? Like, what, even to begin to ask this question, aren't we thereby also asking the question of access, or asking the question of how this how mathematical realism kind of checks out in any philosophical sense?
That's okay. So that's a great question, because what you're asking is, if, as I said earlier, the structuralist post-war French tradition tries to overcome the question of access, how can you even raise the question or even say something like, well, mathematics gives us the discourse of being qua being? That seems to be a claim about access after all, right? And what we're going to see is that these people are actually cheating all the time, right? They say they're not talking about access because they don't really like the business of epistemology all too much. They like epistemology, especially during the 60s. They're in the business of epistemology still. Later, they'll skew it and they'll say, fuck this. But for a little moment right there, when they're looking for epistemological foundations, they will say crazy things like, yeah, mathematics gives us direct access to the real, to being qua being. And by direct access, you can translate this into more prosaic terms and say they don't know how to explain how it is that happens, right? The idea is that mathematics somehow trivializes epistemological questions about what faculties or what modes of cognition allow us to gain a grip on the world or reality or being qua being or whatever you want, but it provides a transparent window into the forms of being as such. Now, that might seem like cheating, and in my opinion, it is. There's a much thicker story, of course, going on here, which incidentally has to do with what Maria was bringing up, which is the relationship between syntax and semantics. The moment that you fold the question of access into a formalized register, into a purely mathematical / logical register, the relationship between mind and world becomes transcribed into the question or relationship between syntax and semantics. In other words, the question of how it is that a transparent formal ideography of symbols, axioms, rules of formation, and inference, etc., can acquire descriptive and explanatory content in relation to a domain of interpretation or phenomena, which is what in model theoretic terms is called a model, precisely. You produce a model for a theory, i.e. for a syntactical machine or system, insofar as you can construct a class of models that satisfy all the axioms and theorems of that theory, of that system. And this conception, esoteric as it might seem, is extremely important. We're going to see that actually Puntel makes a big fuss about this, that in fact we have to understand semantics as essential and indispensable, that we cannot just simply appeal to pure syntax. And this is one of my big debates with Reza, incidentally, right? Which is the relationship between syntax and semantics, right? Reza, Platonist that he is, pure Platonist that he is, wants to kind of go away and erase the semantic side of the story. There's people out there that are saying you can't do that. That if you do that, the price to be paid is a complete relapse to dogmatic metaphysics, and not just dogmatic metaphysics, but a kind of dogmatic metaphysics that renders unintelligible how it is that there's a difference between discourse and the world, between our mathematized, formalized theories and syntactical machines, systems, and what they presumably describe or explain. For after all, ontology is a theory, right? It's a theory of being. But this ofness, if we say that ontology is a discourse about something, this aboutness has to be explained. If you don't explain how this works, in other words, if you just like completely erase the question of aboutness, you don't have an answer. Now, of course, what people like Reza and others will say is that you can't explain these concepts in a purely syntactical, i.e. non-semantic way. We're going to get to that point later when we actually talk with or discuss Puntel. Let me stop there for 1 second and take a look at the chat, because I'm sure there's action there going on here. So there's 23 comments. I hate Aristotle. Okay, that's easy. Maria Lamau. Accessible edits, Lacan. Somebody wrote Lacan wiki. Okay, Lacan. Helpful. Structures, language loop. And then there's a question by Kenneth. Is there something here in regards to a veil of objectivity or such, a language which tries to build an assumptive possibility of objectivity? A veil of objectivity or some such a language which tries to build an assumptive possibility of objectivity. Well, yes, part of what is at stake is how to define, at least in the second tradition, i.e. the analytic tradition of the structural realist philosophy of science. One of the things that we're trying to do is to define the conditions for something like, objectivity in the traditional sense, in which we have something like a correspondence relationship between mind and world, right? Where we can say that our descriptions about the world, water bowls at 100 degrees, whatever we want, if all goes well, captures a fact in the world, or a mereological composition of objects in the world, or something, right? Whatever your ontology is. But the point is that we can define, that's the wager, right? We can define some sort of criteria, epistemic criteria for success, for objective knowledge, right? So that is definitely one of the things that is at stake here. And this is also, I think, resident on others who hold this position might want to just deny any access to the world outside of language. So the ontological question becomes irrelevant, to put it crudely. Well, here's the thing. I mean, we're not going to get sidetracked into this because this is like a can of worms if there ever was one. But of course, there is a question about we use language to describe the world, right? Natural language, scientific languages, formal languages, you name it. Now, the question, of course, is whether this thing we call language enables us to capture something like non-discursive reality, mind-independent, discourse-independent reality. The whole wager of structural realism is that we can, that there's something specifically about formal languages that enables us to escape the veil of language, precisely. That it is actually mathematical languages and formal languages that provide the key to cross the boundary into the great outdoors, as philosophers like to put. Regarding these positive comments from Daniel, we're trying to get away from German idealism, but we are kind of ended right in the middle of it. Maybe not through its historiography, but by dealing with its same concepts. And I think that's fine. And indeed, I mean, there's a whole question about, the shadow of Kant, which looms large in this entire set of debates. On the one hand, the problem of representation, the possibility of escape in representation. But in any case, we're very much in the constellation of questions and concepts that German idealism set for us. There's no question about that, right? But also one of the questions is, and one of the things that actually, specifically the French post-war tradition is trying to do is not only escape from the representational machinery laid by Kant, but also from the perceived idealist excesses of the German idealist philosophers. So we're going to see why or how they try to do this, right? Any other comments or thoughts? No? All right, so let me keep moving forward. Where's share screen here? Enda asks before, what motivation exists for seeking the great outdoors that is not epistemological in some sense, though? And that's another question, right? Like, is it, well, there's two questions. First, what is the motivation to explain, the great outdoors first? And second, is it possible to even have that motivation without it assuming an epistemological scope, right? And of course, if you formulate the question in terms of how do you know the great outdoors, that by definition, tautologically is going to be an epistemological relation, right? Because you're asking about the conditions of knowledge, right? But people like Heidegger, for example, will say that there's conditions of access to the world that are not epistemic, so it's not properly epistemological, right? You can call it phenomenological, existential, whatever, but they're not primarily epistemic conditions of access, right? That would be the Heideggerian solution. Or it could be textual or cultural or discursive or something, right? There's all kinds of possible conditions, right? So, oops, and there's one more comment, sorry. I think this is the question for me. Something with the appearance of objectivity and subjectivity sneak through the shell of objective assumption. Well, that we're going to see if that's the case in fact, right? Like whether in fact there is something that purports to give us the goods, right? The key to the heavens, to the big outdoors, but at the end of the day they fail or not. I mean, that's a perfectly fine question to ask, I think. So now what I want to do is give a series of definitions that actually are going to be rather important. So I'm going to distinguish a set of positions that I think are central to all the things that are going to come. And the first thing to say in this regard is that even though we're going to be focusing in these two traditions, which are from the 20th century, and we're going to finish, of course, looking at Puntel, but a structuralist thesis, as we're going to see, has a series of precursors. And this is actually something that's already identified by John Worrall in 1989 in his paper, where he's going to explicitly trace back the structuralist thesis or the structural realist thesis to Democritus, to the work of Poincaré, and also to Plato, right? So as we will see is actually that structuralism and structural realism become, in at least an embryonic manner, if you will, iterated throughout the different periods of philosophy, and it becomes a subsidiary part of how it is that those theories conceive of their intrinsic aims and motivations. And we're going to see this briefly when we talk about Plato and Descartes and Democritus. So here are the definitions. I'm just going to give 8 here, definitions that I think are going to be helpful. So you should, those of you who don't have much philosophical background, this is like made for you guys. And it's a good thing to keep these close to you, just to remind yourselves of what we're talking about. So the first term that I want to define here is realism, right? And realism can be understood in at least 2 primary senses, a metaphysical and an epistemological one. And then I'm going to speak of scientific realism in particular, and scientific realism can itself be understood both in an epistemological or an ontological manner. But let's begin with the first, which is metaphysical realism. Now, this one breaks into 2. And actually, you can do something similar with all of them, but for clarity's sake, I just keep it to this one. So the global metaphysical realist thesis is the thesis according to which there exists or there is a world or reality independent of our minds. And not only minds, if that seems too loaded for you, you can say minds, emotions, dispositions, languages, etc., etc. That there is a mind-independent reality, world, being, whatever you want, right? That's the global sense of metaphysical realism. But you can also be a metaphysical realist about something, or about a set of somethings, about a domain. So there's also a local sense in which metaphysical realism is the thesis according to which a specific entity or class of entities is mind independent. So one is a realist about X if and only if X exists independent of any mind. So we might say, for example, all right, electrons are metaphysically real, but phlogiston is not. Physical objects are real, but social entities are not metaphysically real. They're subject dependent, right? Whatever else. I'm not saying this is the case, right? Obviously, I'm just using these as examples. So metaphysical realism is about an entity, domain of entities, or in the largest possible global sense, the world or reality as a whole, existing independently of any minds, subjects, dispositions, observers, you name it. Epistemological realism is the thesis according to which it is possible to know a specific entity or class of entities. So one is an epistemological realist about X if and only if X is knowable to some extent. Notice that epistemological realism does not require metaphysical realism. You could be a complete idealist and say that there is no such thing as mind-independent reality, but you can claim that this mind-dependent reality is completely knowable, right? I could say, for example, well, physical objects are completely ideal. They're not mind-independent. They're subject relative or observer relative, right? Yet it is possible to know them, right? So epistemological realism concerns simply conditions for knowability. And again, you could formulate this in a global or a local manner, right? You could say something like global epistemological realism means that everything is knowable, or you can be an epistemological realist about X, or where X is either an entity or a class of entities, right? Those two should be fairly straightforward. If any of these are not clear, please stop me or jump in if you want to clarify or precisify anything. Of course, I'm running with very, very cursory definitions here, nothing too lofty. Scientific realism, I've already spoken a little bit about this one, but scientific realism is the thesis according to which the unobservable entities, postulates of the sciences are believed to be real. This is already a slightly rarefied conception of scientific realism. There's a broader, laxer conception, which is that the entities described by the sciences are real in some suitable sense, in a metaphysically real sense, right? But in the contemporary sense of scientific realism, it has to do with the existence of unobservables. And what are unobservables? Well, there are different kinds of unobservables depending on different theories. Of course, with Democritus, we already hear that the atoms are invisible, right? So those are unobservable by definition. In the mechanistic paradigm of causation, what Wilfrid Sellars calls the particulate image of modern science, the classical unobservables are microphysical particles bound by mechanistic laws and bound by what is called the impact paradigm of causation, right? Little microphysical particles colliding against each other. But of course, we have all kinds of theoretical unobservables that are introduced in the course of scientific progress, such as fields, waves, you name it, right? But the point is, scientific realism upholds that these entities are not just heuristic devices. They're not just quote unquote, instruments through which we explain the observable world, but they are real in their own right. They have an existence or ontological valence of their own. So that's scientific realism in a nutshell. Its flip side, its counterpoint, is what is usually called instrumentalism. And it's not only instrumentalism, there are, I could just say scientific anti-realism, but instrumentalism is going to be the major target that we're going to be looking at. And instrumentalism is precisely the opposite thesis, is the thesis according to which the unobservable entities or postulates advanced by the sciences are heuristic devices that enable us to understand observable phenomena. This is, as you probably know, those of you who are a little bit familiar with the analytic philosophy of the 20th century, this was actually one of the most central debates that animated the first half of the century concerning the relationship between observables and unobservables. And the debate was essentially centered around the controversy of whether, in fact, the unobservable entities that are postulated by the sciences are real, independent, ontological valences, scientific realism, or whether they're just instruments that enable us to explain the world of middle-sized objects, observable objects and events, such as we experience it in everyday life. Of course, one of the things that we're going to see is that the different structuralist and structural realist strategies that we're going to examine advocate some form, if not of scientific realism, because it's not necessarily about science, but it will turn out to be the case. They conceive of science as of scientific realism as postulating the existence of unobservables of some kind, but it's also a direct challenge to instrumentalism. The idea that the middle-sized objects that we experience and we describe through natural language, the phone, the person, the arm, the face, blah, 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 are in fact ephemeral, non-real valences, and that the truth is actually in the unobservables, that the unobservables are the reality hiding behind the veil of appearances. This thesis, it should be rather familiar, right? Does this sound familiar to any of you after the readings we've done? This should be rather, it should ring a very familiar bell, right? Let me see, chat, somebody said something. Plato, no? Yeah, of course, Plato.
I was going to say I identify as an instrumentalist Platonist or a Goodmanian.
My God. What have people done to you? What is that? An instrumentalist Platonist. What is that? I don't know. But in any case.
Possibly a nominalist, like Nelson Goodman.
Well, yeah, well, like Nelson Goodman, okay. But I don't know. I don't think, well, a nominalist is by definition a non-Platonist, right? Concrete particulars exist, not abstracts. So I don't know how but the Nelson Goodman thing can, I guess, be in some suitable sense considered Platonism. But I don't know. But yes, Plato is the obvious referent here, right? Because for Plato, as you know, and we're going to talk about this in short notice, we have this dualism of soma and eidos, right? Soma, once again, corresponding to perceptible objects and their qualities, the world of sensible presentation of empirical objects, right? The world of experience. And on the other hand, we have the ideas or the forms, eidos, right? But what's interesting is that for Plato, it's not only that there are these two kinds of reality in a kind of Cartesian dualism of sorts of minds and bodies, but furthermore, that the sensible bodies that we perceive, i.e. the soma, are in perfect copies in relation to the models, which are the ideas. And that the true, the highest realities, the real, the permanent, those who deserve the title of being proper in accordance with Parmenidean strictures are the forms, are the ideas themselves. So in a certain sense, you can already see it's something quite interesting, right? Because at the beginning, and this is an idea that I explored in the seminar, in the other seminar that I mentioned earlier, in its inception, there was this perceived tension between naturalism and Platonism, because Platonism is supposed to be about affirming the reality of these idealities, these mathematical abstractions, whereas naturalism is about affirming the reality of empirical, accessible objects and events and laws and whatever else, right? But what happens, of course, is that we realize that as modern science transpires, as we achieve the idea of thesis universalis, scientific realism approximates a kind of Platonism, because it affirms that the world of middle-sized objects and events is in fact illusory, instrumental, or second-order derived realities in relation to these unobservables, which are primary. Now, how do you define the distinction between observable and unobservable? It's not just a relationship of whether you can see it through your eyes or a microscope or something like that, but it has to do with mode of access more broadly. Unobservable entities are what sometimes are called theoretical entities. Those are entities that are known or postulated theoretically, i.e. inferentially, either by abduction or otherwise. In other words, theoretical entities, unobservables, are entities that the scientist postulates because she needs them to make sense of a phenomenon or a regularity, right? So for example, I mean, a great example is actually from philosophy is Kant. If you think about the noumenon, right? The noumenon, the thing in itself, is a postulate of reason, which is an unobservable by definition. It's not something that's a correlate of experience that's necessary in order to explain what appearances are appearances of. You postulate an entity theoretically, inferentially, in order to be able to form an explanatory schema that explains, in this case, for example, how it is that appearances appear, or what appearances are appearances of, right? Observables, on the other hand, are correlated to what is called non-inferential reports. You have a non-inferential report in Salarsian if you have a non-linguistic input and you produce a linguistic output. Whether this non-linguistic input is a sensorial datum or a psychosomatic stimulation of some other form. So those are just some provisional just definitions, subsidiary. Those are too technical, so don't worry too much about this. We then have materialism, okay? And this one's another bag of worms, but the thesis according to which being is set in one sense, this is what is called the thesis of ontological univocity, and that sense, that one sense, is specified by our concept of matter. So materialism says being is one, understood in one sense, and that one sense is specified by what we understand matter to be. Of course, the obvious question is, well, what the hell is matter, right? And as you probably all know, the concept of matter has itself been given a huge variety of definitions and formulations throughout the history of philosophy and science, right? From the physicalist theory that everything that is material is a physical object of some sort, to a more broad-ranging naturalism, which is that whatever is material is finally what is described by the natural sciences, to the Marxist conception that materiality has to do with relations of production, whether these relations of production be bound to human labor or otherwise in nature, to very abstract conceptions that we're going to be examining, such as, for example, matter being pure multiplicities studied by pure mathematics, set theory, the calculus, you name it, right? This is what's called mathematical realism or mathematical materialism sometimes. Pablo, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. I wanted to ask something regarding something that was said just not too long ago, but
sure,
in relation to something that was said previously in turn. So we discussed briefly Platonism, and before you'd said that there was another way to interpret it as something that was not necessarily dualistic, and I know nothing of this reading. So would you dive very briefly into that?
Into the Plato question about whether it can be read in a dualistic or a non-dualistic manner, or
Yes, about how or through which references or authors can one read Plato as a non-dualistic thinker?
yes. So two readers or two authors that do the non-two worlds theory. Well, I'm going to give you three: two analytic, and two continental. Okay. So the two continentals, one is Ian Hamilton Grant. And he has, I can send you the reference later. I can send you the precise chapter where he talks about this. And actually Badiou. Badiou has several essays on Plato, and actually, I believe his seminar on Plato just recently got. Can you mute yourself, Pablo, just for a second, because I can hear the background.
Sorry.
No worries. But yeah, Ian Hamilton Grant and Plato and Badiou. Well, Plato, Badiou, kind of the same thing. So those are the two continental figures. The two analytic figures are Terence Irwin and Gail Fine. So Gail Fine and Terence Irwin, two of the most respected, they're at Kernel, Platonists. Well, Gail Fine is a Platonist. I don't know if Terence is still, but and I don't know if he's still alive, incidentally, but does anybody know? Anyway, whatever. They defend a non-two worlds view of Plato. It's sometimes called a two-aspect view or the epistemic view, where the relation of participation does not have to do a relationship between metaphysically isolated realities, but it has to do with something quite different, which is that forms are inherent in a kind of quasi-Aristotelianism. And that's what the analytics always like to do, transform everything into Aristotle. To say that, Plato is actually saying that the forms are dimensions of physical objects, right? Rather than separated idealities existing in an autonomous domain. Call it the Platonic heavens, right, of the forms. I think, incidentally, these readings are wrong, but that's just my own take. I think that Plato did hold a two-world view, but Any other questions?
Part of my question, just very briefly, my question just came from after reading The Republic, the seventh book. It just from a purely literary perspective, and the style of through which it's written, I would think it's very hard to interpret that as a non-dual theory. That's why I was asking.
Yes, I mean you can see it's not that difficult to anticipate what the one world theory would be. It would be to say something like, well, it's something like what a modern scientist would say. Geometry describes the invariant features of any possible object that obeys these properties, right? This doesn't mean that, there are these forms existing independently as some metaphysical reality hanging in the loose somehow, simply that these are invariant principles that organize how it is that any body in space and time could possibly be manifested. So, the laws of motion describe how any body moves. Geometry describes how spatial figures are organized, relations of proportion, mass, volume, etc. You name it, right? So that these are just principles that organize the visible rather than separated realities existing in their own right? They're principles that organize the world as opposed to separated realities. Is that a good reading or not? Again, it's a broad question. And in fact, it's one of the longest running philosophical debates that has ever existed. I mean, since Plato until today, there's people still writing books about this, right? Okay, so Claudia.
Sorry, doesn't the Phaedrus, where I think it's either the Phaedrus or the Phaedo, I always mix those up because I sound the same. But doesn't that have Plato telling some story about where souls are flying by some procession of the forms in the heavens, and therefore also through dialectic you're supposed to approach the forms which are other than your normal experience, the cave allegory. I now that I hear the details of this reading, I'm that just sounds like cope, really wanting Plato to be real.
Well, so there's another obvious question with regards to Plato, and it's good that we're talking this because we're making headway into talking about some of these things already, which is good. But you also have to periodize Plato, right? Because of course, one of the things that happens is that the theory of forms is actually given different formulations in the early, middle, and late dialogues, right? Yeah. And you actually, when you look at the later dialogues in the Timaeus, Philebus, and the Parmenides, what you have is a reworked account of the forms, right? Precisely answering to some paradoxes that are, first raised by the Eleatic stranger, and then, of course, by Parmenides himself, right? And what happens in this dialogue, specifically in the Timaeus and the Philebus, is that you have an account that's actually quite different than the one you get in Phaedrus, right? Which is precisely very much bound to the idea of this transmigration of the souls, right? Which, of course, gives Plato a good reason to feel at ease in the verge of death, right? I'm actually the next seminar I'm going to be teaching in the new center is on Plato. It's called the Philosophical Life, and it's got to be a reading of Plato's Metaphysics.
That's awesome, because I was about to ask, like, how do you suggest like finding resources to read late Plato, because I've struggled to do so.
I'm your source. No, I mean, no, but I can send you preemptive readings. I mean, there's all kinds of literature, and I'm actually going to be giving a book reference later that is a very interesting reading, a structural realist reading of Plato in the wake of contemporary advances in the philosophy of science, that deals precisely with the late Platonic dialogues and that taps the question of the theory of forms into questions about mereological structure. And the author gets into substantive detail about how that works and that, but we'll have much more to say about that.
That's good. I've been reading Plato with a group of people called the Prometheus Trust, and they seem to be like, they literally believe in like the forms. I asked the guy, he's like, yes, I think forms are real.
Well, that's fine. I mean,
they're really smart, but they are very doctrinal. Anyway.
Well, I'm actually myself, I'm reading the whole of Plato right now, from start to finish, and like doing a close reading of Plato. So I'm in my most Platonist moment right now. Let's see. Okay, so let's keep going the last three definitions, and then we can after this we'll get to start talking about Democritus and Plato and Descartes. Hopefully we'll get to Descartes. I mean, how much time do we have? What time is it? 12:36. So we have roughly an hour. Okay, good. So Pythagoreanism, another term that has been thrown around a little bit already, but okay. The thesis according to which one is a metaphysical realist about mathematical entities, right? So this is the thesis according to which, numbers, sets, types, whatever it is that mathematics speaks about, the basic units or even logical operators or things like that, exist, that they are real, that they have an ontological valence. This might seem like a crazy position to some, but actually some very, very sober, quote unquote, philosophers have held this position at some point or other. For example, Quine, those of you who are familiar with Quine, held this position rather late in life. And in fact, Pythagoreanism is sometimes held to be an inevitable consequence of scientific realism. Because if you think that after all, the natural sciences, especially if you're a physicalist, if you think that physics tells us what's real, but the postulates of physics are highly mathematized, then it becomes rather difficult to explain how it is that you can do without things like classes or sets or something like that. Quine was held to this position. There's a very good interview with Quine by Brian McGee that's online, where he briefly tackles on this question and why he is a Pythagoreanist, and he's put in a bad spot because he doesn't really have much to defend other than by saying, well, we need it, we have to assume it to be the case, but let's let that slide. And finally, the two big ones, of course, is the distinction that I mentioned to before, Platonism and naturalism. And this is just rehearsing what we already said, but Platonism, roughly, is the thesis according to which one is a metaphysical realist about forms or ideas, where the latter are conceived as nonsensible, ontologically determined realities accessed by mathematical cognition. Of course, this presupposes the two-world reading, so bear with me. I'm simplifying for pedagogical purposes. And it's usually contrasted with naturalism. And that's the thesis according to which the entities and phenomena described by the natural sciences in particular, and the world observationally disclosed to empirical cognition, is real and nothing besides, right? So you have an obvious contrast here. Now, I already mentioned this, but in my seminar, Naturalism and Subjectivity, we'll remember that this distinction is unstable because, of course, as we approach the idea of thesis universalis, the very concept of nature becomes itself mathematically conceived. So in terms of these ideal forms, and as we will see, the forms for Plato are in fact mathematically comprehended. They're modeled, in fact, under the model of geometry for him. So those are the definitions here. Hopefully those are helpful, as just devices. Let me take a quick look at the chat here. Blah, 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 blah. I'm going to change my name to Philippus. That would be actually awesome. Like living in fear of late Plato. Okay, so let's talk. Oh, we have a couple questions. Will, first? Or comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask on that last slide with the 8 definitions. I'm just curious to hear you graft like someone like Kant on that. Like, how does transcendental idealism fit with him being like a transcendental idealist and an empirical realist?
Interesting. So, okay, so of course this is not exhaustive, right? So where does Kant fit here? Well, one thing we can say about Kant is, I think, first of all, that when I think Kenton Mayasud has done a lot of good by distinguishing between idealism as a metaphysical thesis and correlationism as an epistemological thesis. So Kant thinks that there is a world out there independently, right? So he's a metaphysical realist, at least in some sense, because he does believe that there is something like a noumenal reality, right? The problem is, of course, we cannot know anything about it, right? So he's an epistemological anti-realist about the noumenon. But nevertheless, he retains a minimal realism, epistemological realism, because we can know for Kant that there is such a thing as the thing in itself, as the noumenal reality, right? It's just that we cannot determine how it is, structured in any way, shape, or form, right? So that's how we would fit it there. So he would be a metaphysical realist about noumenal things in themselves. At the same time, he is a minimal epistemological realist insofar as we can know that they exist, but not how they are structured in any way, shape, or form. That would be my characterization of Kant. So he's a paradigmatic correlationist. Correlationism is the thesis according to which we know only how things appear, but not how they are in themselves. In other words, that everything that we know is a correlate of experience, i.e. is a phenomenon, i.e. it is the correlate of a representation, but it's not a thing in itself. The thing in itself, by definition even, is unknowable. That's the Kantian position, right? Kenneth?
Yeah, this may be a total distraction, and if it is, please just ignore it and don't get into it. But again, just because we're at this moment, like something that I'm always a little interested in is, and this could be my total misreading of like Wittgenstein and investigations, but like, how would we, basically this question of like real enough, and that where would we position this idea that like something's real enough for us to coordinate? And that we don't have, because basically that's just the thing I'm seeing, is that all of these kind of rely on this really hard line between the real. And I'm just wondering, like, and maybe again, if this is not useful right now, whatever, but again, just this question of like, where is this kind of ability to modulate around what's real enough, if that makes sense?
Right. Well, I mean, reality principle, right? How do we adjudicate, first of all, how do you define real, right? So you can define it again in this kind of metaphysical realist sense, right? Whereby real, we would say real is something that is mind independent, right? More broadly, you could say that real encompasses everything that happens to exist, whether it be mind dependent or mind independent. So in that regard, the real would not just include those entities that the metaphysical realist identifies as being mind-independent realities, but also mind-dependent realities, whatever these are taken to be, parties, sensations, thoughts, you name it, right? But the question then, the more refined question is, okay, is there a clear demarcation line to separate something like reality from mere appearance, right? Or reality from whatever you might want to contrast reality with, right? And there's no general answer to that, right? There's a series of answers. So the scientific realist is going to provide a series of criteria that are going to tell you why it is that we should think that what science tells us is real, as opposed to something else, right? As opposed to, I don't know, religion or folk science or something like that, right? You know, somebody who is an anti-realist, but who is, for example, an idealist, might say that, you know, we have very good reason to say that everything that is described by the natural sciences is, in the end of the day, ontologically to be conceived as an ideality of some kind, i.e. as mind dependent, right? And they will have criteria to define what it is that mind dependence is and what it is to be an ideality of some kind. So it's going to depend on your metaphysics and your epistemology. There's no way around it, right? You're going to have to run with your criteria of what is, you know, your basic roster of concepts for what furnishes the world, right? Someone like Heidegger will take a very extreme position, for example, in this regard. If you think about Heidegger, he says something like, you know, well, the being of beings is not a being, right? Being is not a being. The ontic domain of entities is relative to the way we disclose being through all these theoretical and practical comportments, Verhalten, right? But the being of beings, which is the mind independent thing, is not an object. It's not objectifiable. So his criteria for being is one that does not, for example, one that resists assimilation into things like thingness. It's not a thing. It's not an entity. It's not an object, right? So he has a loftier conception of being with a capital B, if you will, right? But again, no clear, there's no general answer to that question, as far as I can tell, right? That's the best I can do, I think, for the moment. Is that okay? Pablo, I think you have a question or comment?
I do.
Yes.
Just a really brief one,
Sure.
yet again. And it's borrowing a little bit off Will's last question regarding Kant. But mine is more about Deleuze. So,
sure.
If Deleuze describes himself as a transcendental empiricist,
yeah,
would that be closer to materialism, or there was another category that was there in the slide just before this one? Yeah, or in instrumentalist. Which one would be closer to? Because I think he's not nearly close to being a realist.
I think so. Two questions. He is a scientific realist of some kind. Okay. Now, but the question is he a materialist? He claims to be a materialist. Okay. He even says so at several places. The question is he really? One thing that we're going to figure out very, very soon is that one has to always make a difference between what a philosopher says and how they argue for it. Because what it turns out is that a lot of these people say that they are, or that they are vouching for X or Y, but the question is, what do they really accomplish, or what really follows from what they've said, right? And I think Deleuze is a paradigmatic example where he wants to say that, you know, first of all, that, you know, science does tell us what is real, but in the interest of, or in the attempt to consolidate a kind of materialist philosophy that's also a naturalist, empiricist framework, I think he ends up advocating a kind of idealism at the end of the day. And there's a reason for this, at least in the early transcendental empiricist version of his work. I think in his work with Guattari, things get much more tenuous. But in difference and repetition and in the logical sense, there's a good sense in which his theory of larval subjectivation, in my opinion, dovetails into a kind of idealism. And this is a position that I incidentally credit. It's not a reading of my own, or it's not an insight that I came up with by myself. I credit that to Ray Brazier. If you want to, there's two articles that I recommend for that particular reading. The first one is chapter 6 of Nihil Unbound, the pure and empty form of death, where he produces a dual reading of Heidegger and Deleuze, and difference and repetition in particular. The second one is, which one was the other one that I want to talk about? I had two texts and I forgot the other one. Oh yeah, by Ray. The second chapter of his doctoral dissertation called Alien Theory, where he tackles Deleuze and Guattari's machinic ontology. And there in both of these places, he makes the claim that Deleuze's materialism relapses into a kind of idealism. And I also have I have a text where I make that argument as well, in a different way, sort of. Eduardo?
I wanted also to extend a little bit of Will's and Pablo's question and like how this applies to Lacan, and also to return to what Kenneth has asked, how the conception of the real for Lacan enters into this division of reality and what is not, and like the real is something traumatic, is a traumatic encounter, something that can be processed through language, and how this might give us another perception on it.
Yes. Okay. So, I mean, with regards to the Lacan, I'm not going to answer that now because we're going to actually look at a text by Jacques-Alain Miller where he is going to talk about that pretty much head on. And so that will give you that idea. But as you know, just to sort of make a very cursory and provisory indication, Lacan throughout his work gives a series of definitions or iterations concerning the real as an impositive formalization, as that which resists symbolization, and so on and so forth, as, a traumatic kernel. And he speaks also of objepitia as a real object of desire, right? So the question is, well, what's its ontological status? And I don't know if you know, but this is a question that actually Jacques-Alain Miller asked Lacan straight up. I believe it's in the Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis where he begins by actually addressing this question. He says, Lacan, that he was asked this question. And what I can say is this: Lacan himself never quite was able to figure out that answer. He tried to, and he looked at Heidegger for answers, and it didn't work for him very well. I think Miller actually moves closer to getting it, where it should be. And of course, more recently, people like Zizek have tried to extirpate something like an ontological transvaluation of the Lacanian conception of the real into an ontological register, right? And you probably know how Zizek works with this already since the parallel, since the parallax view. He specifically correlates the notion of the impossible object to the concept of parallax, and more recently, and of course, in Search of Lost, not in Search for Lost Causes, in Less Than Nothing. But yeah, so we'll talk more about that next week, right? So that will be a matter for next week. And let me just quickly check the chat, and then we'll keep going. Yes, Daniel W. Smith has several papers actually where Daniel Smith is the most the cleanest Deleuzian you can want. And also Manuel Delano obviously is very much in the business of insisting that he is actually a materialist of sorts. But there's a lot of reconstructive surgery and a lot of things that you got to completely erase in order to make that work. For example, the theory of larval subjectivation, the theory of the faculties, all of that stuff has to sort of be weeded out if you want to make it work. And I think if you weed it out, you get a problem also. We're going to read an essay by Deleuze, not actually from his, but we're going to actually look, it's actually the clearest thing he ever wrote, in my opinion, which is kind of weird to say. Let me see. Yes, on Plateau, he and Guattari use pragmatics. That's right. I mean, they use in Deleuze and Guattari's work, there's 100 and different 50, from cybernetics, machinic ontology, machinic, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, let's move forward. Okay. So as I mentioned to you, John Worrall actually traces the history of structural realism all the way back to Democritus and Plato, which is why I wanted us to take a look at this. Now with the Democritus, of course, we're dabbling with fragments and commentary, so it's reconstructive, not really direct, what we can make out of it, but we see the foundations of this. And in this original inception in the ancient philosophical world, we see that the structural realist thesis is bound, of course, to a metaphysical investigation, right? It is a central metaphysical question, and it is bound to two things. On the one hand, in the case of Democritus, the atomist theory, right? What's called atomism. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then, of course, in the case of Plato, to the theory of ideas, and specifically his account of the divided line, which is rehearsed by the allegory of the cave in Republic 7. I picked Republic 7 because it's the most accessible, not having the time to really, and especially for just one session, if I had made you read the Parmenides or the Timaeus or Philebus, we would have been dead. You know, there's no way we can cover that. But you know, the allegory of the kid is sort of it's clean. It's clean. So let's just rehearse the basics about this. And I'm going to tell you why precisely we think that these two people are precursors to structural realism. It will come clear soon when we look at some passages. So Democritus defends a metaphysical dualism. As you know, there are two fundamental kinds of entities, i.e. the atoms, which are infinite in number, indivisible in magnitude, and then there's all kinds of debates concerning its properties, and I'm going to specify a few of these. And the other thing is the void. The void is the medium in which atoms are situated. And in this regard, it is considered to be, this atomist view, a precursor of the modern mechanistic scientific view. Actually, it is widely held today that if you look at ancient metaphysics, Democritus is the one that comes, you know, the framework that comes the closest, if you will, to the mechanistic view of nature that we get after Newton or from Newton onward. Atoms and void. Now, this dualism, as you probably all know, again, from these passages, was actually quite controversial. Plato is said to have detested Democritus, partially because Democritus's dualism goes against one of the most treasured principles of Parmenides, which is the thesis of ontological univocity, which is that being is unitary, being is one. Part of the problem was that, of course, for Parmenides, the thesis that being is one led to a series of consequences which for many were inadmissible or unacceptable. Among these, primary among these, is the non-reality of motion. Motion has to be considered to be somehow illusory, right? Because if being is one, right, and there is no multiplicity inherent to being, and if non-being is not, right, non-being is not, then what the one cannot change. If there's no change, there's no motion. Ergo, there's no motion. The introduction of the void as a universal medium in which these infinite multiplicity of atoms can interact and form structures with each other, as we'll see, is precisely meant to make possible a resolution or a response to the Parmenidean affirmation of the non-reality of motion. One of the big things that's happening in this philosophical conjuncture is, as we will see, and you also see this, of course, in Book 7 of the Republic, Plato himself is not at ease with the idea that motion is not real. He thinks that we have to explain motion, the motion of the celestial bodies, the motion of, you know, not only of the celestial bodies, but the motion of bodies in motion, right? And one of the things that he says towards the end, I don't know if you remember or you picked up on this passage, but he says that we have geometry, right? Geometry gives us the quote unquote formal analysis of space, i.e. of extended magnitudes of forms as they exist in the world, what he calls elsewhere analytical idealities. But we don't have a science of motion yet. And of course, to understand the science of motion is inherent to understand for Plato the first principle, which is what? Let's hear it. What is the first principle? The greatest form, the most important form.
Form of the good.
The form of the good, exactly, the form of the good. Now, this is something that's the most misunderstood element of Plato's metaphysics, in my opinion. When Plato speaks of the form of the good, people think he's talking about morality or something of the sort, right? Like what's good for a good life or something like that. He's talking about teleology in general. And this is something that comes much clearer once you read Aristotle. Remember what I said before, there's an inextricability between form and telos, between the form that something has and the purpose that it fulfills. Telos, i.e. purpose, defines a processual dimension of entities. The telos of something defines what something does, its function, how it behaves. So the idea that Plato has in mind here is that in order to actually have a comprehension of the forms, we need to set them to motion. We need to understand how the forms move, how they fulfill their intrinsic nature. Their telos, the form of the good, is a principle of motion. is a principle of how it is that each form is capable of realizing itself. You know, what's the typical example from Aristotelian sort of metaphysics, right? You think of something like, what is the form of a tree? Well, it's already embryonic in the seed, right? The entire morphogenetic developmental becoming that leads from the seed planted in the soil all the way to the branching of roots and the growth of the plant, that entire process encompasses the telos that is the form of the tree. The form of the tree includes this life, this functional becoming. Plato and Aristotle still didn't know how to define these things, right? Of course, they didn't have the tools to do it. That's something that we would only really start to understand or get in modern science, when we get a mechanics of motion precisely, right? Which is how it is that these forms, the geometrical world of spatially extended bodies, right, are also engaged or involved in these diachronic processes of becoming. The forms are alive. The forms have a life of their own, right? So we have this dualism of atoms and void in the Democritean conception. The relationship between the atoms is one of mechanistic principles and mereological composition. Now, we don't have to get too engrossed with how this works, but we're going to say a few things because it turns out that this is where the structuralist element comes out cleaner or more clearly. Plato, in turn, proposes a metaphysical dualism, again, going by the dualist reading, the two worlds reading, of soma and eidos, sensible bodies and their qualities, which are lowly derived realities in relation to pure ideas or the realm of the forms, right? And what I've already said is that the ideas are organized teleologically and dialectically. One of the reasons why Democritus is held to be a precursor to modern science is because in given a mechanistic account of the relationship between the atoms swirling in the void, he gives a purely mechanical and non-teleological description of the world, whereas Plato still believes that these forms are somehow teleologically pregnant, right? In other words, they have purpose, they're functionally alive. This has to do in the contemporary philosophy of science. Those of you who are a little bit more familiar with contemporary analytic philosophy might know that this is a very much alive problem, a problem that's very much alive, sorry, that concerns the place of functions in nature. How do we define something's function? Because in order to define a function, you usually have to make recourse to teleological vocabulary. But teleological vocabulary is drawn in analogy with practical reasoning. For example, not to be too convoluted, if I say the function of the heart is to pump blood throughout the organism, right? I'm describing the action of the heart in analogy with the way that we humans reason practically about how we act, right? I'm saying the heart does something in order to, as if the heart had purposes, right? Or aims. Now, obviously, the way that we would normally interpret this kind of locution is to say, well, it's a figure of speech, right? We're not saying that the heart has itself a mind or purposes or something like that. We're just saying that it acts as if it had purposes. Those of you who are familiar with Kant know that this question is actually very much present in the third critique, when there's a description of nature as exhibiting a purposefulness without purpose or purposiveness without purpose, right? The world, obviously, I mean, nature as a whole is not animated by purposes. It's not a giant mind. Kant was no panpsychist, but nevertheless, it exhibits a kind of functional organization, right? How do you describe functional organization without relapsing into teleological metaphysics? Well, Democritus just gets rid of telos, explains everything in purely mereological mechanistic ways. Plato still preserves it, but because he doesn't have the resources, he's still a teleological metaphysician. Let me see the chat real quick. The emotion. Jesus, this is degenerating quickly, isn't it? Now, the thing is that both atoms and the forms are known by mathematical cognition. I already mentioned to you that for Plato, the paradigm that gives us access to the realm of the forms is geometry, of course. And later, of course, we've already read Descartes. It's an amalgam of formal procedures, but it includes primarily what are the two? Let's hear it. Test, quiz. What are the two main, well, I mean, there's four, right? But the two major formal mathematical paradigms that feature for him. Crickets. Okay, nobody knows anything. One is geometry, and what's the other one? Algebra. Jesus. Algebra and geometry, right? Algebra and geometry, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Hopefully, we have half an hour. Okay, great. Now the thing is, notice this goes back to what we were talking when we were discussing. Let me see chat real quick. Algebra. Yeah, it will. Yeah, but you cheated. You totally didn't know. Anyway, but notice both the forms are understood through mathematical cognition, and they are unobservables. The atoms are they're subatomic. Well, subatomic, I shouldn't say. They're realities that subtend, that they're too small, right? The infinitely small realities, indivisible units, infinite in number, that underwrite the world of middle-sized objects and their relationships, which we observe as the common going on, right, of the world. The forms, on the other hand, are these archetypal models, as I described already to you, in relationship to which physical bodies are considered to be copies and which are set to participate in the forms, right? This relationship of participation. And we're going to take a look at the divided line in a little bit, because it turns out that there is actually, and this goes back to, I think, a question that Kenneth was asking about degrees of reality, right? It's not only, I mean, Plato is obviously, there's a dualism at work, but there's also a kind of fourfold division, so that the two domains is in turn each divided into two, right? And what we're going to see is that the domain of the visible is actually divided into two. The domain of the intelligible, of the ideas, of the forms is also divided into two. So there's a kind of, and not only they're divided and autonomous, but there's a line going from the less to the most real. And there's a criterion. Let me see what's going on. You must leave a little early. Okay, no problem. All right. The other thing, just before changing the slide, is that both of these philosophers are interested in understanding something like not only the principle of motion, which they cannot really explain, right? I mean, but obviously that's at the core, but also the invariant principles, that which does not change. So the sensible world appears in perpetual flux, but provides no stability, right? But there are these things that never change. The atoms never change. They're indestructible. Everything that exists is a reconfiguration of the atoms in the void, which is part to explain. So this has to do with questions not only of mereology, but of identity. It is the good old question that, of course, we first hear with Heraclitus. You cannot step into the same river twice, right? The idea is that reality is in perpetual flux, but if reality is indeed in perpetual flux, then there's nothing that allows anything to be identified as subsisting from one instance to another. Everything is ahaicity, as we call it. In other words, always being recreated at every instant. But this is a problem, because if that is the case, then we cannot speak intelligibly about anything, right? And that's part of what motivates the Parmenidean idea that being is one. Being has to be one, permanent, unchanging. But how do you explain permanence in a world that is affected by change, right? And so the idea is that by postulating these unobservables, you can explain the invariant principles that underlie the changing world of the senses. The changing world of the senses, the apparent chaos of the sensible world, and the multiplicity of opinions that we traffic around, and that the artists are the best at producing, and blah, 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 including the poets, of course. Those are underwritten by these invariant principles, unchanging principles, which are given precisely by the metaphysics, right? The atoms swirling in the void, bound by mechanistic principles, the forms articulated dialectically and teleologically organized, and the bodies as participating in them. Give me a second. Here is the essential, the biggest, the most important quote concerning Democritus by Aristotle from the Metaphysics. And I'm gonna focus on on the core. Leucippus and his associate Democritus declare the full and the empty, the void, to be elements, calling the former what is, to on, and the other what is not, to meon. Of these, the one, what is, the atoms, is full and solid. The other, what is not, is empty and void. I'm sorry, and rare. This is why they say that what is no more than what is not, because the void is no less than body is. The void is real, is existing, right? These are the material causes of existing things, right? Just like we say, for example, that the causes for physical bodies are microphysical particles and their interactions, so the atoms and the void organized mechanistically are the causes of bodies. It's a very, I mean, it's very visionary, right? Very much ahead of its time, of course. They declare that the differences are the causes of the rest. Moreover, they say that the differences are three. Here is the essentials. Please pay attention. The differences are three: shape, arrangement, and position. For they say that what is differs only in rhythm, touching, and turning. And of these, rhythm is shape, touching is arrangement, and turning is position. What the does this mean, right? Like, this doesn't make any sense when you look at it. But Aristotle does an enormous favor to us all and gives us an example. Look at this. This is like a Saussurian exercise, right? For A differs from N in shape, right? AN from NA in arrangement, and Z from N in position. I hope that's clear, right? I hope that's clear. All right, good. Concerning the origin and manner of motion in existing things, these men too, like the rest, lazily neglected to give an account. So once again, you see the problem of, like, they don't have a good account of motion and rest. You know, obviously motion and rest being correlative notions. What is interesting about this definition, this is the passage that people latch on to say Democritus was not only a proto-mechanistic scientist, blah, 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 that anticipated the modern mechanistic paradigm of causation and whatever, but also a proto-structural realist, because the atoms are not qualitatively specific. They don't have a qualitas. It's not, the atoms are not red or blue or pig or tiger or plant or anything, right? The only thing that defines the identity of an atom, it's its relational properties in relation to other atoms. And these relationships are three in kind. Who do you think he has in mind here, Democritus? Like, who is he, like, well, not in mind, obviously, but what I mean is, what does this resonate with? I mean, those of you who are a little bit, have more training in mathematics, or does this sound very simple? I mean, I'm going to give you a clue, but elements. All right. Doesn't this resonate with something? Euclid. We're going to go back to that. I'm not going to get into this right now, but we're going to, when we look at Puntel, we're going to see how the Euclidean principles of organization are actually modeled in this way. It's very interesting. But the point is here that, again, atoms being non-qualitatively specific units of existence whose mereological composition are responsible for everything else that exists can only be defined by their relational structure. And so the question becomes, what is this relational structure? As you can see, it's almost topological in nature. It has to do with how you manipulate these symbolic primitives, right? There are differences in shape, right? These are purely, like, if you want to transcribe this into modern ideography, you would say you have a set of symbols, right? Where each atom has a particular specific shape, right? That constitutes its spatial dimension. Then you have arrangement, which is how it is that the atoms, insofar as they relate, can be positioned in and by the way, the relationships of arrangement, of course, when you look at it in the analogy of words in a page, they're going to be horizontal and adjacent. But in theory, these arrangements include a three-dimensional space, of course, right? So you can have relationships of arrangement of something being on top of another, being to the side, being below, and whatever else, right? Think of it of any kind of positioning relationship between two objects, right? Or system of such objects. And finally, there is the actual position of the objects in the void, of course, right? Now, what's interesting is that the void is necessary, according to Democritus, to explain how any of these possible relations obtain, whether arrangement, shape, or position. If there is no shape, there is no extension. If there is no extension, extended space wherein objects can interact, then there's no arrangement. And if there is no room for objects to move or to engage in motion, then there cannot have changes of position. And what is change? It is change of position, right? Or arrangement or shape, finally, right? By convention, sweet. By convention, bitter. This is actually accredited to Democritus, but it's quoted by Sextus. By convention, sweet. By convention, bitter. By convention, hot. By convention, cold. By convention, color. But in reality, atoms and void. Beautiful, right? It's a glorious minimalism of his philosophy. Let me look at the chat because there's 14 comments. Let me see. Marx writes his thesis on Democritus's materialism. I have not read that actually, and I would be very interested in looking at that now. That's actually it hadn't even crossed my mind, surprisingly. Yeah, let me see. I'm just looking at the comments real quick to make sure. And Marx's defense of Epicurus' rundown of materialism against Democritus's atomism. That would be very interesting to read for sure. That would be very interesting. I'm going to take a look at that. And a few more quotes, just these three more, and then we'll shuttle to the Plato because we're going to run out of time. Anyway, okay. Nonetheless, Democritus is found condemning them, the senses. For he says, we in fact understand nothing exactly or exact, but what changes according to the disposition both of the body and of the things that enter it and offer resistance to it. Quote one. Another thing that, of course, I'm trying to get across here is that in this incipient form of structural realism, right, if you want to call it that, as Worrall suggests, there is a coeval valorization of mathematical cognition as the obverse of a devalorization of the sensible. That is obvious, right? In every case, the sensible world is something that needs to be explained away or is somehow in a lower tier of reality, right? So that's an interesting relationship that we're going to see subsists in the contemporary structural realism, but in a different way. What we have is a devalorization not only of sensibility, but also of natural language and qualitative determinations specified in natural languages. Interesting, but we'll see. You don't have to worry about that. There are two kinds of judgment. This is great, by the way. This is fantastic. There are two kinds of judgment, one legitimate and the other bastard. All the following belong to the bastard: sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. The other is legitimate and is separate from this. When the bastard one is unable to hear or to see or hear or smell or taste or grasp by touch any further in the direction of smallness, but we need to go still further towards what is fine, then the legitimate one enables us to carry on. What is the legitimate? Sextus doesn't tell you here, right? But what is the legitimate? I think Enda or somebody? No? It's the intellect. It's the intellect, right? The bastard is the senses, right? Obviously, he's enumerating the five senses here, right? And it's the same dualism that you see in Plato, right? The devalorization of the five senses and their revalorization of the intellect. Finally, here's the pairing. Plato and Democritus supposed that only the intelligible things are true or real. Democritus held this view because there is by nature no perceptible substrate, since the atoms, which combine to form all things, have a nature deprived of every perceptible quality. This is amazing, actually. I mean, this is absolutely extraordinary because the atoms are, this is what people don't understand. It's like Democritus is not saying that if you grab a microscope, you would see the atoms and, you would see, oh, well, they have no perceptible qualities. Which means something quite interesting because we just saw in the previous slide in the quote that we saw, well, in the previous, that they have shape, right? And now shape seems to be some kind of perceptible quality. It's not a quality, a secondary quality. It's not color, it's not sound, but it is an extended magnitude. And after all, extended magnitudes, shapes, are visible objects, right? After all, they're modeled on visible phenomena, points, lines, and planes, right? How can you conceive of spatial determinations like shape without correlation to the visible? Can we have a conception of space that is not bound to perception, to sensibility? That idea is what places Democritus in proximity to structural realism. The attempt to salvage a notion of space and time that is no longer bound to anything resembling qualities or perceptual knowledge or perceptual experience. And this, of course, is also very much in the heart of the structuralist post-war French tradition, when people like Badiou, for example, speak about subtracting the intelligible from the sensible to access the realm of the pure multiple, untrammeled, uncontaminated by the vagaries of the sensible world, delivering us to the Platonic heavens, right? So the Platonic dualism, and here is the divided line, as we call it, right? In a little bit more of a sort of organized manner. I'm not doing a close reading of because that would take us far afield, and I just want to, this is just to rescue the precursors. So as we already mentioned, thinking enables the individual to pierce beyond the world of sensible experience and to progressively apprehend the forms which are the guiding organizing principles of the world, which are not presented to the senses, right? But which are true eternally. The forms are indestructible, eternal. They're one. They're self-unified. I really recommend that if you look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Plato, there is, and specifically there's an article on the theory of forms. And specifically, I really recommend you look at the article on the Parmenides, because as you know, the Parmenides, among other things, there's a question about the relationship between being and non-being, the one and the many. But in there, I don't remember who wrote it, but the article in question in the Stanford Encyclopedia. But there he, the author, rehearses what in analytic philosophy has been distilled as a series of axiomatic postulates that organize the theory of forms. And there's about 8 of those, if memory serves me right. But if you want to look at the theory of forms in minute detail, that's the place to look. I'll actually compile them for next time, and I'll just show them to you very quickly, and we'll go through them like that, right? But of course, in Republic 7, he famously draws this allegory, right, which reflects the divided line, and which introduces the divided line into a processual dimension. I like to think of this relationship between the account of the divided line, which already appears in Republic 6, and Republic 7, kind of an analogy to how I like to read Wilfrid Sellers' account of the images, and then you look at the myth of Jones. The myth of Jones and the images, the allegory of the cave, and the divided line. The divided line just gives you the typology of the different domains or clusters or regions or tiers of being, if you will. The allegory of the cave describes an epistemological process of how it is that the mind progressively moves throughout these tiers of being, right? And we are all familiar with the basis of the allegory, right? Badiou has a gorgeous reading about this, where the return to the cave of the prisoner is what he calls politics. Politics is the return of the prisoner to the cave to liberate the other prisoners. We must return to the cave, and that movement of return is politics. And everybody goes like, "Wow!" Anyway, but so here in this chart of the divided line, we have a coordination between, on the one hand, the faculties or the operations of the mind, and then the ontological valences, i.e. the objects. Objects is actually not the right term here. I should say entities or beings or whatever. This is not my chart, I just borrow this. But it's it's universal. Everybody has some version of this somewhere. But it goes from the bottom to the top. And as you can see, there is actually a division in the middle, a thicker line, that separates between the 2 big tiers, which are the intelligible world and the sensible world. There's a content also overtone here with the nominal phenomenal distinction. I don't think it's warranted, so forget about that. Just erase that from your mind. Focus on intelligible and sensible. At the lower level, we have the tier of what is called images. What is in Greek? Does anybody know?
It's not eidos, is it?
No. Eidos, eidos is idea.
Eidos is the idea, at the other end of the scale.
But it's actually close. It's eidolon.
Yeah.
Eidolon. And of course, corresponding to this, we have what here is called imaginings. And in the, I should have actually taken the trouble to complete this and do a third column to say what is the image in the allegory that corresponds to this. What would be the figure in the allegory that corresponds to this lower level? Felipe?
Oh, sorry, I have a question related to this, but I will
absolutely. Go for it.
Yeah, because I wanted to ask if it's possible to map this process of cognitive assent as some kind of, is it mappable as intentional assent? Because I was thinking of Salesian picturing as binding the syntax of the senses with semantics, and thus binding the manifest and the scientific images, or is this just too much conflation?
Well, in the locution that you mentioned, there's a few things run together with shouldn't. Picturing is not a semantic relationship. First of all, it's a causal relationship, right? There's a distinction between signification and picturing. Picturing is representational. It has to do with a nomological isomorphic, second order homeomorphic mapping between words or nouns considered as natural linguistic objects and processes in the world in the last instance. Signification are relationships of inference between tokens, right, in propositional states. So those are two different. But yes, to answer your question directly, there is a progression of representation here, right? Because to each of these faculties, there corresponds a distinctive kind of reality that it apprehends. The imagination is the faculty that enables us to grasp images. Images, eidolon. And eidolon are not even objects, are less than objects, right? They're the lowest tier of reality that is possible. Now, the other thing that you mentioned, which is the scientific and manifest images, I don't think that's here at all thematized. I don't think that's actually part of it. I mean, you can make the claim that once, as you move to the top, right, you get to something like a scientific image of sorts, right? But I think that would be a little bit too forced. I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't try to take it there. But there is a picturing relationship for sure, at every step of the way, right? So in the first instance, we have what would be the image in the not image, but the figure in the allegory, the first tier. Shadows, the shadows reflected in the wall, right? Obviously, right? The shadows that are projected onto the wall by the fire behind the prisoners that they see, right? So it's already a visible, here imagining is used in a kind of very lax manner in the sense of imaging. It should be imaging more than imagining, really, right? Because imagination has to do with these internal representations or, that we tend to associate in the vernacular, but we mean more imaging, right? Seeing things that are projections of something else, copies of copies, because at the second level, we have sensible objects, right? And at this level is where we find ourselves immersed in the world of belief, the world that we navigate, the world of physical objects, the phone, Hernan's beautiful, beautiful face. Look at Hernan, everybody. Look at Hernan. Anyway, the world of objects, people, stuff, right? That's the second tier. The objects that are actually the sources for the images, the shadows that are being projected onto the wall. That would be what corresponds to this tier. We're here in the sensible world. And as you know, objects are copies themselves of the forms. So after this tier, we get to the next level, which is the domain. We finally cross to the domain of the intelligible, which of course the crossing of the line corresponds to what process? in the allegory?
The turning.
The turning, well, the getting out of the cave, right?
Sure.
Right, moving out of the cave into the light of day. And what happens, of course, to the prisoner, to the unbound prisoner, when he reaches the light of day in the radiance of the sun? What's the first thing that happens?
A blinding light.
A blinding light. You cannot see, for your eyes have not been accustomed to see the truth, right? Of course, the whole thing about the allegory is that it's all based through perception, but already at this point, we're supposed to get the sun as an allegory, not of sight, obviously, but of illumination, of enlightenment, right? Where the light of the sun and the blinding force of the sun in the moment of liberation corresponds to the difficulty and confusion that we have when we first try to understand, right? When we first sort of question the beliefs concerning the world and the objects that populate it, and we, for the first time, try to ascend to the intelligible. Enda, go for it.
Is it too crude to say here that for Plato, something that is like autonomy or freedom comes as a result of something that happens to the subject, whereas in Kant, it is a process that is more like, it's a self-law-giving, right? Like in contradistinction to heteronomy, it's autonomy. And so would we be able to like draw that distinction, or is that too crude? And does that map onto this kind of distinction between structural realism and the epistemological position?
That's very good. That's a very good question. So I haven't thought of it, but intuitively, I think, yeah, there's something quite interesting. I mean, liberation, freedom for Kant is a given, you know, and the way you negotiate with freedom is precisely through the use of reason as a law-giving faculty that, you know, provides itself for maxims of action, right? And it acts in accordance to these maxims. For Plato, it is a process of liberation. You're not free by default, right? You do not in order to exercise freedom, you have to go through this procession, right? It is something that in fact is only reserved for the philosopher, right? It's a unique, a strange thing where philosophy here is an instrument for liberation, right? To pierce through. So I think that's actually an interesting distinction, right? Rather than naturalizing freedom or essentializing freedom as a kind of innermost nature, right? A noumenal freedom that we have, right? And we possess organically. For Plato, it is something that requires work. And in fact, most of us never have it, right? For Plato, the default is we live in ideology, and those who live in ideology or, you know, shuck in the world of images and you know, opinions are not free, right? So yeah, I think that's right.
Daniel, just a heads up, we're over our time. Just
yeah. Oh crap! Yeah, we're out of time. All right, so let me stop there. What is good is that, so I was gonna just go through a few more things with Plato and then talk about Descartes. The Descartes is very quick because it's only a few pages long, and I will start talking about good sense next time and talk about the Descartes. What's interesting, I already had this planned out. So there's a perfect thread that ties in the Descartes to our reading of Deleuze for next week as well. So what we will do next week is there's a set of readings. They're all sort of short. The Deleuze is the most difficult one. Well, the Miller is also a little bit tricky, but those are the two big ones, right? Deleuze and Miller. They're rather esoteric texts. Those of you who do not have much philosophical background might find yourselves a bit perplexed. So do not hesitate to write me an email in case you need some guidance or orientation, or in case you don't understand anything and you just need, what does this mean? You know, something very basic. It's fine. I was actually, you know, anticipating that we wouldn't get to Descartes. Descartes is going to be the platform to shuttle into next week's business. So next week we'll be starting by talking about the structuralist post-war French tradition and talking about the appropriation of structuralism in that tradition. So with regards to, very quickly, I'm not going to waste much of your time. Discord, we could use the class Discord for those clarifications. That sounds perfect by me. Perfect. So very briefly, now there is a new format for presentations. You have to make groups of 2 or more. Arnab and I are going to set up a cloud document, which you will have available. Essentially, what we'll do is this. So we have about 20 22 participants in class. Well, there were 22 earlier. There's 20 now, including Arnab, so, well, and myself. So there's 18. We're going to take a look at how many people there are total to see if it's feasible to fit these in during the sessions or whether these are going to be submitted via email. Ideally, they will be in during the session. Ideally, again, it would be groups of 3 or 4 so that we can minimize the number of presentations because we don't have much time, okay? And for the presentations, you can pick any of the readings or topics, or you can branch out and maybe bring in some materials that are not being considered, but you think are relevant to the questions we're raising and talk about that. Now, how you guys get together and organize yourselves and which groups you form, I don't know. Actually, I'm not, you know, I'm not, do we know it? Hernan, do you have any indication about how that's supposed to work or?
No, but I've created a spreadsheet with all the text and I'm going to share it. So you can assign yourself or put your name down to start getting on groups of 2 or 3.
2 or 3, okay. So let's aim for 3 per reading or per week or thing, or no, actually per reading. So or you know, so you try to fit a 3 slot mark, and what we will do is just, you know, go from there. And it's not terribly clear.
I think that would be best because
yeah,
because we have 7 texts that we're covering in the next 3 sessions. So if we're 20, should be like ideally per groups of 3. Yeah.
Hernan, Enda saying that you need to grant access.
Let's see.
To the thing.
Sure. Okay, I'll figure this out offline so I don't take more of your time.
Okay, and just very
yeah.
Okay, and very quickly, so the readings are all in the class drive. If you can't find them, just let me know. And the other thing very quickly is, so final paper, 4,000 to 6,000 words. You can write on whatever you want on any of the readings topics. You can take this in your own direction. I'm fine. If you need any help or guidance, or you know, I'm not gonna give a prompt or anything like that. I'm not, like, we're all adults here. You can all figure out what you want to explore in your own accord, right? I presume. So that's fine. And if you need any help, of course, finding a topic or thinking about anything, I'm more than happy to talk with you at any point. So just shoot me an email or whatever, and I'm available. So yeah, any questions before we close shop? I'm sorry to take a little bit of your time. It's already 5 past, but if anybody has anything they want to put out there, I would be happy to answer any questions.
I just wanted to double check where your direct email was, because I'm sure I'm going to have to ask you a couple questions.
Sure. I think it should be in the website. There should be an instructor section where my email should be there. If not, let me just give it. I'll write it in the chat right now, so anybody who doesn't have it can very quickly. Just give me 1 little second, and because I don't know how to write.
Thank you.
No problem. Here we go. That's my email. All right. So I think that's it for us today. Sorry for lagging a little bit, but I actually predicted this would happen with Descartes, so it's fine. Next time we'll begin with Descartes. Just review the Descartes and then do the readings, and we should be good. Golden. All right. See you next week. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you. Ciao.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks. Bye.